Before we dive into our analysis, we need to jump back to 3 very important concepts which we covered in Stage 4. An author's purpose, that is, what they are trying to convey throughout their text. Their context, which means we need to consider how both an author's personal and societal context has influenced their text. And finally, genre. Do we see evidence of any genre's particular stylistic conventions in the work? Make sure to keep all 3 of these concepts in mind as you begin to analyse prose texts on your own. Let's get started. Let's begin with the most fundamental element of prose analysis, narrative structure. In Stage 4, we looked at the basic linear structure, as well as how writers might vary this structure through plot twists, cliffhangers, and flashbacks. Today, we are going to start with another common variation to the linear narrative structure, often used in conjunction with flashbacks, beginning a story in medias res, which is Latin for into the middle of things. Starting in the middle of the action is quite common in modern narratives, as it allows writers to skip a lengthy introduction. Instead, we dive straight into the complication. Here's an example from Edgar Allan Poe. This is the very beginning of his story, The Telltale Heart. The narrator in Poe's story throws us right into the middle of the action. He is dreadfully nervous, has some sort of disease which is putting him on edge, heightening his senses and turning him mad. Luckily for us, Poe's narrator promises that he will tell us the whole story. While some writers may choose to fill in the gaps with flashbacks, Poe's narrative instead takes the form of a descriptive recount. We are thrown in medias res and then forced to follow our narrator as he turns back and slowly picks up all the missing pieces. Why would Poe begin in medias res? Poe's unnamed narrator doesn't have to bother explaining who he is or where he is or anything else for that matter. Instead, he can focus solely on telling his story. In medias res is a great way for writers to force readers to learn about characters through their actions rather than through drawn-out descriptions. Let's now look at an example of a non-linear narrative structure, the circular structure. A narrative which follows this framework begins and ends in the same place, so we describe it as a circular or cyclical narrative. Take, for example, James Thurber's short story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. This is the beginning of the story. Thurber's narrative begins with a daydream as the main character imagines himself as the pilot of a US Navy flying boat during a storm. Eventually, Walter is woken out of his daydream, signalled by the ellipsis at the end of the paragraph. An ellipsis is the ... that you see at the end of the daydream. After a few different episodes, shifting between reality and daydreams, Mitty ends the story the way it began, with an ellipsis, signalling the beginning of another military-inspired, heroic daydream. Why does Thurber use a circular structure here? By beginning and closing a narrative on the same note, circular structures emphasise the persistent, cyclical nature of that event. Here, Walter falling into his heroic daydreams. Let's put this into a Peel paragraph. Remember, Peel stands for point, evidence, explanation, link, and is a great way to make sure that you back up your main point in each paragraph. You might come across other paragraph methods like PETAL, which stands for point, evidence, technique, analysis, and link, or TEAL, which stands for topic sentence, evidence, analysis, and link. All these words are different ways of remembering the same essential paragraph structure, where you state your idea and explain evidence to prove your point. For now, let's use the Peel method. Our main point is that Thurber highlights how Mitty's dreams offer him a persistent escape from his mundane daily life. As evidence, we could say that the circular structure, signalled by the repeated use of ellipsis to end the introductory sequence and introduce the ending, encircles the narrative with Mitty's heroic, military-inspired dreams. Next, we need to explain our evidence. By effectively trapping Mitty within these dream sequences, the circular structure emphasises the persistent escape that these dreams provide him. Finally, we would link our explanation back to our main point. Thus, Thurber's use of a non-linear narrative structure reinforces how Mitty's dreams offer him a refuge from his otherwise mundane existence. Let's now move on to narrative setting. In Stage 4, we introduced the idea of narrative setting and how an author might use a particular setting to introduce a certain theme. Today, we're going to look at how writers might use different settings throughout a narrative. Sometimes, an author will use contrasting settings to emphasise unique aspects of each location. Take this example from Emily Bronte's novel Wuthering Heights. Whilst Wuthering Heights is described as dark and grim, Thrushcross Grange is described with adjectives such as mellow, sweet, and altogether calm and peaceful. The contrast in setting supports Bronte's differing characterisation of the people from Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Those from Wuthering Heights are characterised as more wild and unsophisticated compared to the refined, peaceful people at Thrushcross Grange. Let's put this information about setting into a peel paragraph. Bronte highlights the differences between the people of Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Wuthering Heights is covered in misty darkness, whereas Thrushcross Grange is mellow, sweet, and altogether soothing to the ear. These contrasting settings highlight the contrasting characterisations of each setting's inhabitants. The Wuthering Heights residents are wild and unsophisticated, as opposed to their calm, civilised counterparts in Thrushcross Grange. Thus, Bronte's contrasting settings support her contrasting characterisation of the people from Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Another narrative element we need to look at is narrative perspective. In Stage 4, we introduced you to the basics. First person is when the writer directly refers to themselves, as in, I opened the book. Second person is when the writer addresses the reader, you opened the book. And third person is where the writer reports the action from a third-party standpoint. He opened the book. Using different perspectives can radically change how narrative events come across to readers. First person adds an intimate, personal touch, often granting readers access to the narrator's thoughts, motivations, and reflections. Second person brings the reader into the story, creating a more immersive, interactive atmosphere. Whilst third person gives the appearance of reliability as our narrator recounts events. But let's now move away from just the three basic persons and instead take a deeper look into the concept of perspective. Sometimes third-person narrators will dive into characters' thoughts, detail secret events that a third party couldn't possibly have seen, or will even jump between different spaces and times. We call this form of narration third-person omniscient narration, which comes from the Latin words meaning all-knowing. Let's jump back to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice for a quick example. How could our narrator know what the main character, Elizabeth, was feeling? This is an example of the third-person omniscient narrator, and Austen uses it throughout Pride and Prejudice to maintain the illusion of detachment from the story, whilst still being able to delve into Elizabeth's personal thoughts. On the other hand, a third-person narrator who doesn't have access to characters' thoughts and feelings is simply termed an objective narrator, which is used to give the most unbiased, objective narration possible. Sometimes, authors use a subjective narrator. A subjective narrator only retells events from one viewpoint, following one character very closely and narrating their interactions, thoughts, and feelings. For this reason, third-person subjective narration is often referred to as the over-the-shoulder perspective, as opposed to the objective narrator, which works from a bird's-eye view of the action. Let's look at an example in James Joyce's short story, The Dead. The narrator is working from the third person. He had never felt, but still has access to Gabriel's feelings without taking on the all-knowing capabilities of an omniscient narrator. What makes this example subjective is that our narrator throughout The Dead only has access to Gabriel's thoughts and feelings, as opposed to an omniscient narrator who would be able to pry into the minds of every character. Joyce uses this mode of narration to give us an in-depth understanding of Gabriel's personal emotions and relationships. Let's look at one last big picture element of prose, characterisation, or how writers construct and depict their characters. In Stage 4, we learned that most texts feature a hero or protagonist, as well as a villain, who we call the antagonist. Occasionally, our protagonist will be an anti-hero, meaning he might not have some of the traditional heroic qualities like bravery, courage, morality, or a desire to achieve for the greater good. We can jump to Albert Camus' novel, The Stranger, to illustrate this. The protagonist, Meursault, has just shot a man on the beach. Look what he does next. But I fired 4 shots more into the inert body, on which they left no visible trace, and each successive shot was another loud, fateful rap on the door of my undoing. Meursault is the narrator and protagonist, so we readers connect with him throughout the story. But throughout the novel, Meursault is always emotionally disconnected from the events around him. He doesn't feel sad when his mother dies, and he doesn't feel guilty when he kills someone on the beach. He doesn't seem to care about morality at all. He's definitely not a traditionally good hero. That's why many describe him as an anti-hero. Also, throughout a work of prose fiction, you'll meet some minor characters. Minor characters have smaller roles in the novel or story. Often, the protagonist's interaction with the minor characters drives the plot forward and helps our main characters to develop. Some minor characters might function as foils. A foil is a character who contrasts our protagonist to highlight certain aspects of their character. Let's look at an example from Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Here, the narrator, Offred, describes Moira, an important minor character. Moira was our fantasy. We hugged her to us. She was with us in secret, a giggle. She was lava beneath the crust of daily life. In the light of Moira, the aunts were less fearsome and more absurd. The protagonist is locked up by the government with some other women, including her friend Moira. But Moira's rebelliousness gives the women hope. Offred uses a metaphor to describe Moira as lava because of how vibrant and dangerous she is. In contrast, the narrator Offred is always passive and is often depressed. She isn't fierce and rebellious like her friend Moira. See? Including Moira in the story emphasises how reluctant Offred is to rebel against the cruel government. The main function then of utilising foils is to highlight certain aspects of our protagonist's personalities through contrasting those traits against the opposite in our foil. Let's try putting that information into a peel paragraph. Atwood highlights Offred's passivity and reluctance to rebel. Moira is introduced as a foil to Offred. She is described metaphorically as lava beneath the crust of daily life. The metaphor captures Moira's disruptive and vibrant rebelliousness, which implies a contrasting characterisation for Offred, who is later revealed to be passive, relying on Moira as a fantasy of rebellion to give her hope. Thus, Atwood emphasises Offred's tendency towards inaction through a contrasting characterisation in her foil, the always rebellious, ever-defiant Moira. To wrap up our lesson, let's recap our understanding of a niche genre we discussed in Stage 4. The coming-of-age novel, or Bildungsroman. This is a fantastic example of how an author's genre might influence their process of characterisation, as almost all Bildungsroman novels feature naive protagonists who are put through some sort of complication in order to discover something new about themselves or the world around them. Be on the lookout for other ways in which genre could influence characterisation. For example, dystopian novels often feature nostalgic protagonists who fight against a strict new society, while romance novels tend to follow a protagonist's wobbly path on their search for love. And that brings us to the end of the lesson. Fantastic effort! In this lesson, we looked at the big picture elements of analysing prose fiction, those being purpose, narrative structure, setting, narrative perspective, and characterisation. Now you've learnt all the tools of prose analysis. You're ready to dive into writing some of your own. Come on, what are you waiting for? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons on Stage 5 English Essentials, check out our analysis of Powering Through Prose Lesson 2.